So I've just watched the much talked about debate on Good Morning Britain between Piers Morgan and Ross Greer, who's a member of the Scottish Parliament representing West Scotland. He's only 24, he's the youngest ever member of the Scottish Parliament, apparently, elected in 2016. He is a member of the Scottish Green Party and he was a campaigner for Yes Scotland during the 2014 referendum. So he's a Scottish nationalist by definition. So the debate on Good Morning Britain was, in fact, about this man. Point in the right direction there. Yep. Winston Churchill. Churchill has been named the greatest Briton, both in that 2002 Great Britain survey and I think by general sort of consensus. I think most people regard Churchill as our greatest national figure. He's a towering figure without question. But this specific debate was about the 1943 Bengal famine, which was a devastating famine. Up to 3 million people died. And Ross Greer apparently has published something, I'm not sure about the details, but he's published something accusing Churchill being responsible for millions of deaths and being a mass murderer. Piers Morgan took issue with this and he got into a heated exchange with Ross Greer. Piers Morgan took it very personally because he has his brother's an officer in the British Army, and he said it was offensive, and he said he spoke to his brother, who was spewing rage over this, and Morgan clearly was as well. They aren't the only ones. I think a lot of people, particularly conservatives, and a lot of people will be angry over Ross Greer's comments. So this is my take on it. And I want to kind of divide this video into, I guess, two parts. The first part is about Churchill and issues around that, and the second part is about Ross Greer. So, firstly, Winston Churchill. I have long believed that no historical figure should be above critique. Morgan did say that at one point, but nevertheless, he also said it was very offensive. So he was implying that Churchill shouldn't be above critique, which I don't agree with. I think any historical figure should be open to debate. However, I do think that there has been a tendency for the hard left in recent years to try and revise Churchill's legacy. And what I mean by revise is they want to talk about the negative and they want to talk about the fact Churchill did make some pretty controversial comments that were basically racist. There's no point glossing it over. I think today Churchill wouldn't get elected. But they want to look at those things and totally ignore the incredibly important role that Churchill actually played. I mean, the simple fact is, without his leadership, we would not have got through World War II. I don't think there was anyone else that could have led the country at that time as a war leader. Attlee was a great prime minister, but he was more the domestic prime minister. I think as a war leader, Winston Churchill was really unparalleled, and I do wish some on the left would put things in context. World War II was the biggest conflict in human history. It was total war. And without Churchill's leadership, there's a very strong chance we could have been occupied by the Germans. I mean, the recent film Downfall, I think, was pretty accurate in terms of the just how precarious the situation was. Um, And so this left wing revisionism tends to focus on his politically incorrect attitudes. Although Gandhi also had some pretty controversial views. Nelson Mandela supported communism at one point, and Mandela often praised dictators. So a lot of great figures actually have controversial sides. And that's why I'm against any sort of personality cult. I remember earlier there was a debate about statues, and I'm not going to make this video about that, but just as a quick reference, apparently a statue of Margaret Thatcher's had to be put on a plinth to prevent from vandalism, and it got into a debate about what should be protected, what shouldn't. should statues be sacred and so on. Well, with Winston Churchill, it's kind of his legacy has become a battleground. I think most Britons, even on the centre left, recognise Churchill was a great man. But they also recognise that by today's standards, he had attitudes that were archaic, and that's also true. But Churchill was a great man, there's no question about it. And I think he probably was our greatest Briton. Um, Now, in terms of the Bengal famine, what Ross Greer was saying was he didn't care. Morgan got very angry with this and he produced quotations from a series of letters and correspondence from Churchill's War Department in which, throughout the war, he was actually pleading with allies to provide help to relieve or where he expressed concern for the suffering of the Bengal famine victims. There were major famines, of course, in both during the Raj and before that as well in Mughal India. Um, but I think it's important to also look at the context. This wasn't peacetime, this was wartime. So there's no question it was a humanitarian crisis. But, and I must confess, I haven't looked at the details of this, but there was a war effort going on. The empire's resources were being used on a daily basis to fight the threat of fascism and Japanese imperialism. So I think the context is also extremely important. I think it would be a lot harder to defend Churchill were we talking about peacetime, but we're not. And therefore, the context is very important. So that's the first side. Um, and I will say this Piers Morgan, as always, let his arrogance come through. And it's really a pity because, again, this is a situation where I may veer, I'm probably more in agreement with Piers Morgan. But as always, he brings a guest on and he just shouts over them. I mean, this morning needs to drop Piers Morgan because this happens time and time and time again. And I think they do it for entertainment purposes. I think it's a very cynical thing, really. And Susanna Reid barely gets a word in sideways. So I think Piers Morgan has a very obnoxious style. I think I made a video about this. I actually agree with a lot of what Piers Morgan says. I agree with a lot of his opinions. I just don't like the way he goes about it, shouting over people. It's a school of journalism that I find incredibly obnoxious. Jeremy Paxman's another one. Morgan needs to, and I think it's about time that someone really stands up to him and says, I'm not talking about Ross Greer, incidentally, but just someone at the BBC or someone at Good Morning at ITV says, your ego needs to be kept in check here, Piers. Um, but I think people like Piers Morgan are incredibly egotistical, so they sort of think they're above. Um, Probably he would make like, "Oh, I am this morning. Lose me and you lose the show." Some that sort of situation. But it's something I've never liked about Piers Morgan. I think he has an incredibly arrogant streak in talking over people. Why bring guests on your show if you're just going to interrupt them? I understand that you can have strong views on something, but this business of trying to shout over guests is pathetic. I don't like it. Anyway, that's the first point. Second point, Ross Greer. Well, like I say, he's only 24. He's a member of the Scottish Parliament. I would probably disagree with him on almost everything. I'm a staunch unionist, and I have a big problem with those of the blame Britain for everything mentality. I mean, Ross Greer ticks all the boxes of a typical leftist. The evil British are to blame for everything. He talks about mass deaths and Churchill being a mass murderer. Well, apparently he's a former communist. I don't know if that's true or not. I don't know if that information is accurate. Wikipedia doesn't mention that. If it is true, well, two things. I think you have to allow to some extent for his age, because people can be pretty gullible when they're young. So I think his youth you could sort of excuse him to some extent. But if he's still at the age of 24 defends communism, For him to talk about Churchill being a mass murderer, well, I'd like to know what his attitude is to the millions dead under Mao and Stalin, who were the biggest murderers of the 20th century. So, I have no doubt he would say either it's not real communism or he would try to make excuses for them, because that is what the regressive left always do. Having said that, some of the backlash from unionists against Ross Greer are ad hominem. I think it's very possible to criticise someone like Ross Greer without getting into ad hominem attacks about his appearance. I heard someone, for example, say he's a ginger Scottish prick. Now that's totally irrelevant ad hominem sort of nonsense. Um, and I have to be honest, I'm 150% pro union, but sometimes I see attitudes on unionist pages which are not necessarily, I think, the best PR for the unionist cause. And I'm not talking about unionist leadership, I'm talking about particular Facebook groups that are, I don't know, I just don't think they're particularly helpful for the unionist cause. Um, there is a thing about the Green Party, and this is probably true in England as well. They're watermelons, green on the outside, red on the inside. I think there is something in that. I think there's definitely a hard left aspect, far left aspect to a lot of green ideology, and it goes well beyond environmental concerns. I think they're actually pretty far left in many areas. I mean, I'll see what transpires. I don't know if this guy is going to be a significant force in Scottish politics or not. He's getting attention because of this exchange. That's my thoughts on it. But I would conclude with this. Number one, Churchill's not above criticism, but the criticism has to be contextualized. And too many on the left don't do that. They don't consider this was total war, this was world war, and Churchill's leadership was incredibly important. Number two, um, Ross Greer represents Scottish nationalism and the Green Party. I would probably find that I would disagree with him on almost everything. And number three, let's criticise Scottish nationalists, let's scrutinise them, but let's not go to ad hominem attacks about someone's hair colour or, well, I'm a redhead, so obviously I can't do that, but that just doesn't win arguments. It's stupid, and I think people should desist from doing that sort of thing. Anyway, I'll leave it there. Let me know your thoughts, and thanks for watching.